The MiG-17 pilot squinted through his canopy at the small aircraft approaching from the south. Below him, the jungle stretched endlessly toward the DMZ, but his attention was fixed on what looked like a toy plane compared to the massive B-52s and twin-engine F-4 Phantoms he'd been trained to intercept. "Another scooter," he radioed to his wingman, using the dismissive nickname North Vietnamese pilots had given the Douglas A-4 Skyhawk. The single-engine jet looked almost comical next to the supersonic fighters dominating the skies over Vietnam. Small, subsonic, and seemingly defenseless, it appeared to be little more than a training aircraft that had wandered into a real war. What that MiG pilot didn't know was that he was looking at one of the most underestimated killing machines in military aviation history. In the early years of the Vietnam War, North Vietnamese pilots had developed a hierarchy of threats in their minds. At the top were the massive B-52 Stratofortresses, capable of obliterating entire grid squares with their devastating bomb loads. Close behind were the F-105 Thunderchiefs and F-4 Phantoms, supersonic fighters that screamed across the sky at twice the speed of sound, bristling with missiles and cannons. Then there was the A-4 Skyhawk. To enemy pilots, it looked like a relic from an earlier era of aviation. Lieutenant Colonel Nguyen Van Bay, a veteran MiG-17 pilot who would later become North Vietnam's third highest-scoring ace, recalled his first encounter with an A-4 during a 1965 mission over the Red River Delta. "We saw this small, slow aircraft flying alone," he remembered years later. "My wingman asked if we should engage it, but I told him to save his ammunition for real threats. It looked like a training plane that had lost its way." This dismissive attitude wasn't limited to North Vietnamese pilots. Soviet military advisors stationed in Hanoi had studied the technical specifications of American aircraft deployed to Southeast Asia, and their initial assessment of the A-4 was equally unimpressive. In classified cables to Moscow, they described it as a lightweight attack aircraft of limited capability, suitable primarily for close air support of ground forces. The numbers seemed to support their conclusion. While the F-4 Phantom could reach speeds of Mach 2.2 and carry up to 18,000 pounds of ordnance, the A-4 was limited to subsonic speeds and appeared to be a much smaller platform. Anti-aircraft crews were instructed to prioritize targets based on size and speed, which meant the lumbering B-52s and screaming F-105s drew most of their attention. Radio intercepts from North Vietnamese fighter pilots during this period reveal the casual contempt with which they viewed the A-4. "Scooter at 2 o'clock" became a common radio call, delivered with the same tone one might use to point out a bicycle on a highway full of racing cars. Some pilots referred to it as the toy plane or the American trainer. This underestimation extended beyond the cockpit. North Vietnamese intelligence reports from 1965 and early 1966 consistently downplayed the A-4's combat potential. One report, captured by U.S. forces during a raid on a Viet Cong command post, described the Skyhawk as a secondary threat aircraft, primarily used for harassment missions against rear-area targets. The anti-aircraft crews manning the growing network of surface-to-air missile sites and conventional flak guns around Hanoi and Haiphong were explicitly told to focus their limited ammunition on high-value targets. In the deadly calculus of air defense, every SA-2 missile and every burst of 85mm flak had to count. Wasting precious resources on what appeared to be a minor threat made no tactical sense. Even the physical appearance of the A-4 worked against it in the minds of enemy pilots. Its compact delta wing and single engine gave it an almost stubby, truncated look compared to the sleek lines of supersonic fighters. Where the F-4 Phantom looked like a missile with wings, the A-4 looked like someone had taken a full-sized fighter and compressed it into a more manageable package. MiG pilot Captain Pham Thanh Nhan, who flew dozens of intercept missions during the early war years, later described his first visual contact with an A-4. "It was so small, I thought it might be a reconnaissance aircraft. We had been briefed that American pilots sometimes flew observation missions in converted trainers. The idea that such a tiny aircraft could carry a meaningful bomb load seemed impossible. This systematic underestimation would prove to be one of North Vietnam's most costly intelligence failures. While enemy pilots were dismissing the harmless scooter, they were actually looking at an aircraft that would deliver more ordnance per dollar spent than any other platform in the American arsenal, fly more combat sorties than any other Navy aircraft in the war, and earn a reputation for devastating effectiveness that would haunt the dreams of enemy ground forces for years to come. The story of how the world's most underestimated bomber came to exist begins not in a boardroom filled with military brass, but in the cluttered workshop mind of a German-American engineer named Ed Heinemann. In the early 1950s, while other aircraft designers were caught up in the post-war obsession with bigger, faster, and more complex machines, Heinemann was quietly developing a philosophy that would revolutionize military aviation. Heinemann had cut his teeth during World War II designing dive bombers for Douglas aircraft, but the experience had taught him something his colleagues seemed to have forgotten. In combat, simplicity saves lives. He watched as increasingly sophisticated aircraft spent more time in maintenance hangars than in the air, their complex systems failing under the stress of combat operations. Meanwhile, the workhorses of the war, aircraft like the P-51 Mustang and his own SBD Dauntless, succeeded, precisely because they were simple, reliable, and easy to maintain. By 1952, the U.S. Navy was facing a dilemma that would define the next decade of military aviation. The Korean War had demonstrated the need for a nuclear-capable attack aircraft that could operate from aircraft carriers. But the existing options were either too large, too expensive, or too unreliable for sustained combat operations. The Navy wanted something that could deliver an atomic bomb to a target hundreds of miles away, then return safely to a pitching carrier deck in the middle of the Pacific. Most defense contractors responded with proposals for massive twin-engine monsters packed with the latest technology. Heinemann took the opposite approach. He walked into the Navy's design competition with a proposal that shocked everyone: a single-engine aircraft that would be smaller, lighter, and cheaper than anything else on the drawing board. "Keep it simple, stupid," became Heinemann's unofficial motto, though he preferred to phrase it more diplomatically. His design philosophy centered on what he called brutal simplicity, the elimination of every system, component, and feature that wasn't absolutely essential to the aircraft's primary mission. If a system couldn't be justified in terms of delivering ordnance to target and returning the pilot safely home, it didn't belong on the aircraft. This approach put Heinemann at odds with virtually every trend in 1950s aircraft design. While his competitors were adding sophisticated radar systems, complex hydraulic networks, and redundant flight controls, Heinemann was stripping away everything he considered unnecessary weight. His team became obsessed with weight reduction to a degree that other engineers thought bordered on madness. Every component was scrutinized for weight-saving potential. The landing gear was designed to be as light as possible while still capable of handling carrier operations. The wing structure used innovative construction techniques that maximized strength while minimizing weight. Even the pilot's seat was redesigned to save a few precious pounds. The radical nature of Heinemann's approach became clear when he made the most controversial decision of the entire design process. The A-4 would have only one engine. In an era when military doctrine demanded twin-engine redundancy for safety, especially for carrier-based aircraft, this seemed like professional suicide. Navy pilots would be flying hundreds of miles over open ocean with no backup power source if their single engine failed. Heinemann's team had calculated that a single Pratt & Whitney J52 turbojet would provide sufficient power for their lightweight design, but the decision went deeper than mere performance calculations. Twin engines meant twice the maintenance, twice the fuel consumption, and exponentially more complex systems integration. A single engine meant the aircraft could be smaller, lighter, cheaper to build, and more reliable in combat. The Navy brass initially reacted with skepticism bordering on hostility. Carrier aviation had always been about managing risk, and deliberately designing an aircraft with a single point of failure seemed to violate every principle of naval aviation safety. Test pilots expressed concerns about the survivability of single-engine operations over water. But Heinemann had done his homework. His analysis of combat loss statistics showed that engine failure was responsible for a relatively small percentage of aircraft losses compared to combat damage, pilot error, and system complexity failures. A simple, reliable single engine was actually safer than complex twin-engine systems that were more likely to malfunction under combat stress. The breakthrough came when Heinemann's team demonstrated that their lightweight design could carry an unprecedented payload relative to its size. The aircraft that other engineers dismissed as too small would be capable of carrying its own empty weight and ordnance, a capability that exceeded many aircraft twice its size. This wasn't just engineering innovation. It was a complete reimagining of what a combat aircraft should be. On June 22, 1954, test pilot Robert Rand climbed into the cockpit of a stubby, delta-winged aircraft that looked more like a flying triangle than a serious military weapon. The A-4D-1, as it was designated before the Pentagon's naming system changed, sat on the runway at Edwards Air Force Base, looking almost comically small next to the massive experimental aircraft that typically dominated the test facility. What happened next shocked everyone who witnessed it. Ron fired up the single Pratt & Whitney J65 engine, rolled down the runway, and lifted off into the California desert sky. Within minutes, it became clear that Heinemann's radical design wasn't just functional, it was exceptional. The aircraft handled like a dream, responding to control inputs with a precision and agility that belied its attack aircraft designation. The first flight lasted only 45 minutes, but those 45 minutes changed everything. When Ron climbed out of the cockpit, he was grinning from ear to ear. "This thing flies like a fighter," he told the assembled engineers and Navy observers. "Hell, it flies better than most fighters." The test results that followed were even more impressive. The A-4 could carry 9,900 pounds of ordnance, literally its own empty weight in bombs, rockets, and missiles. To put this in perspective, the aircraft weighed about 10,400 pounds empty, meaning it could double its weight in destructive payload. This was a capability that exceeded the famous B-17 Flying Fortress of World War II, achieved in an aircraft less than half the size. Even more remarkable was the cost analysis. While contemporary fighter bombers like the F-105 Thunderchief carried a unit cost of over $2 million, the A-4 could be built for approximately $860,000. This wasn't just a modest savings, it was a revolution in military procurement. For the price of one F-105, the Navy could buy more than 2 A-4s, effectively doubling their strike capability for the same budget. The production numbers that followed told the story of an aircraft that had found its perfect niche. Douglas Aircraft's Long Beach facility began churning out Skyhawks at a rate that astounded industry observers. By the end of 1956, the production line was delivering aircraft at a pace that would eventually total nearly 3,000 units over the aircraft's production run, making it one of the most economical fighter bombers ever manufactured. Navy test pilots quickly gave the aircraft a nickname that would stick throughout its service life: Heinemann's Hot Rod. The moniker captured both the aircraft's impressive performance and its connection to the engineer whose unconventional thinking had made it possible. Unlike the often sarcastic nicknames that plagued troubled aircraft programs, this one was delivered with genuine affection and respect. The Navy's initial reception was cautious but increasingly enthusiastic. Admiral John Hoskins, who oversaw the Navy's attack aircraft programs, later recalled his first briefing on A-4 capabilities. "We expected a capable light attack aircraft. What we got was something that could outperform aircraft costing twice as much and requiring twice the maintenance. It was almost too good to believe." Early operational deployments before Vietnam validated the test results in real-world conditions. The A-4 proved capable of operating from short, rough airstrips that would challenge much larger aircraft. Its simple systems meant that maintenance crews could keep it flying in conditions that grounded more sophisticated platforms. Most importantly, it demonstrated an ability to deliver precision strikes with an accuracy that impressed even skeptical ground commanders. The aircraft's delta wing design, initially criticized as unconventional, proved to be perfectly suited for carrier operations. The wing provided excellent low-speed handling characteristics for carrier approaches while maintaining structural integrity under the stress of repeated catapult launches and arrested landings. Carrier deck crews found they could move, fuel, and arm the compact aircraft with an efficiency that exceeded larger, more cumbersome platforms. By 1960, the A-4 had become the Navy's primary light attack aircraft, not through political maneuvering or contractor lobbying, but through the simple expedient of being better at its job than anything else available. The Bantam bomber had proven that in military aviation, as in many other fields, bigger wasn't necessarily better. Smarter was. To understand why North Vietnamese pilots so catastrophically underestimated the A-4 Skyhawk, you need to look at the specifications that enemy intelligence analysts were working with. On paper, the aircraft appeared to be everything its critics claimed: underpowered, slow, and limited in capability compared to the supersonic fighters dominating military aviation in the 1960s. The heart of the A-4's deceptive nature lay in its single Pratt & Whitney J52 turbojet engine. While competitors like the F-4 Phantom roared through the sky on twin J79 engines, producing a combined 23,000 pounds of thrust, the humble Skyhawk made do with a single power plant generating just 90,300 pounds of thrust in its most common variant. To pilots trained to equate engine power with combat effectiveness, this seemed like bringing a knife to a gunfight. The speed differential was even more damning in the eyes of enemy analysts, where the F-4 Phantom could reach speeds exceeding Mach 2.2 and the F-105 Thunderchief could push past Mach 2.1. The A-4 was limited to a maximum speed of just Mach 0.95, barely subsonic. In an era when military doctrine emphasized speed as the primary survival mechanism for combat aircraft, this limitation appeared to be a fatal flaw. North Vietnamese intelligence reports consistently focused on these apparent weaknesses. Captured documents from 1965 describe the A-4 as technically inferior to modern Soviet fighters, and note that its subsonic speed makes it vulnerable to interception by MiG-17 and MiG-21 aircraft. What these reports failed to recognize was that speed wasn't the only factor determining combat effectiveness. The A-4's compact delta wing design further contributed to its underestimated appearance. With a wingspan of just 27 feet and an overall length of 40 feet, it looked almost toy-like compared to the 63-foot wingspan of the F-4 Phantom or the 64-foot length of the F-105 Thunderchief. Enemy pilots who had trained to identify threats based on visual size cues consistently categorized the A-4 as a minor threat. But hidden within these seemingly modest specifications was the aircraft's true genius: the shocking payload capacity that would redefine what a small aircraft could accomplish. The A-4 could carry up to 9,900 pounds of ordnance on 5 external hardpoints, a capability that exceeded many aircraft twice its size. To put this in perspective, the famous B-25 Mitchell bomber of World War II, with its twin engines and much larger airframe, could carry only 3,000 pounds of bombs internally. This payload capacity became even more impressive when analyzed in terms of efficiency. The A-4's empty weight of approximately 10,400 pounds meant it could carry nearly its own weight in destructive ordnance, a ratio that was virtually unmatched in military aviation. While larger aircraft might carry more total payload, none could match the Skyhawk's pound-for-pound efficiency. The aircraft's range and endurance capabilities were equally deceptive. Despite its single engine and compact fuel tanks, the A-4 could fly missions of 920 nautical miles with a full combat load, or extend that range to over 2,000 nautical miles with external fuel tanks. This gave it the ability to strike targets deep in enemy territory and return safely to base, a capability that enemy planners consistently underestimated. Perhaps most importantly, the A-4's design philosophy of brutal simplicity translated into reliability that exceeded much larger, more complex aircraft. While twin-engine fighters might spend days in maintenance for every flight hour, the Skyhawk's simple systems meant it could fly multiple sorties per day with minimal downtime. This reliability multiplier meant that a single A-4 could deliver more ordnance over time than aircraft with theoretically superior specifications, but poor operational readiness rates. The deception was complete. An aircraft that looked obsolete on paper would prove to be one of the most effective combat platforms of the Vietnam War. When Operation Rolling Thunder began in March 1965, it was conceived as a carefully calibrated bombing campaign designed to force North Vietnam to the negotiating table through the systematic destruction of military and industrial targets. The operation would eventually become the longest sustained bombing campaign in American military history, but in those early months, Pentagon planners had no idea that their most effective weapon would be an aircraft they'd barely considered. The A-4 Skyhawk's deployment to Southeast Asia wasn't part of some grand strategic vision. It happened almost by accident, driven more by logistics than tactical planning. The Navy needed carrier-based attack aircraft that could sustain high sortie rates in the tropical climate of the South China Sea, and the A-4 was available, reliable, and cheap to operate. What nobody anticipated was how perfectly suited this simple aircraft would prove to be for the grinding day-after-day reality of sustained combat operations. Lieutenant Commander James Stockdale, flying A-4s from the USS Oriskany, led one of the first major Rolling Thunder strikes against North Vietnamese targets in August 1965. His post-mission report captured the aircraft's emerging reputation. The Skyhawks performed flawlessly under conditions that would have grounded half our other aircraft. We launched in weather that kept the F-4s on deck, delivered our ordnance precisely on target, and recovered without a single mechanical abort. This reliability became the A-4's defining characteristic in Vietnam. While more sophisticated aircraft struggled with the heat, humidity, and primitive maintenance facilities of forward operating bases, the Skyhawk just kept flying. Maintenance crews discovered that the aircraft's simple systems could be repaired with basic tools and minimal spare parts, often under conditions that would challenge a peacetime garage mechanic. Chief Petty Officer Mike Rodriguez, who maintained A-4s aboard the USS Intrepid throughout 1966, later recalled the aircraft's incredible durability. "We had Skyhawks come back with holes you could put your fist through, hydraulic lines severed, electrical systems shot to pieces, and they'd still be flying." The pilots would taxi up to the line, shut down, and ask when their bird would be ready for the next mission. Half the time, we could patch them up and have them airborne again within hours. The aircraft's payload capacity, initially dismissed by enemy analysts as insignificant, proved devastating in practice. A typical A-4 strike package could carry combinations of 500-pound general-purpose bombs, 750-pound napalm canisters, 2.75-inch rocket pods, and 20mm cannon ammunition that delivered destruction far exceeding what enemy forces expected from such a small platform. More importantly, the aircraft could deliver this ordnance with precision that larger, faster aircraft often couldn't match. Captain John McCain, later a prisoner of war but then commanding Attack Squadron 174 flying A-4s, described the aircraft's combat effectiveness in a classified after-action report. The Skyhawk's stability and handling characteristics allow for precision delivery of ordnance under combat conditions that would challenge larger aircraft. Our pilots consistently achieve target accuracy that exceeds mission requirements while operating in threat environments that force other aircraft to compromise their attack profiles. The numbers began telling their own story as Rolling Thunder intensified. A-4 squadrons were flying more sorties per aircraft than any other Navy platform, delivering more ordnance per dollar invested and achieving higher mission success rates than their more expensive counterparts. The aircraft that had been relegated to secondary missions was quietly becoming the backbone of the Navy's air war over North Vietnam. Enemy forces began to notice the pattern. Intelligence reports from late 1965 showed increasing North Vietnamese concern about what they termed the small bomber's effectiveness. Anti-aircraft crews reported that the compact aircraft was difficult to track visually and presented a smaller radar signature than expected. More ominously for enemy morale, the A-4's ability to deliver devastating strikes with apparent impunity was beginning to affect the psychological warfare aspect of the bombing campaign. By early 1966, the A-4 had evolved from an afterthought to the Navy's primary strike weapon over North Vietnam. The aircraft that enemy pilots had dismissed as harmless was flying deeper into defended airspace, hitting harder targets, and returning home more consistently than platforms costing twice as much to operate. The secret weapon was hiding in plain sight, disguised as an obsolete trainer, but performing like a precision instrument of destruction. Rolling Thunder had found its perfect tool, even if it took months for anyone to realize it. The true measure of the A-4 Skyhawk's devastating potential became horrifyingly clear during a series of missions in late 1966 that would forever change how both sides viewed the capabilities of Heinemann's simple design. What happened in the jungles south of the DMZ wasn't just tactical bombing. It was environmental warfare on a scale that shocked even the pilots delivering the ordnance. Lieutenant Commander Rick Adams was leading a four-ship formation of A-4s from Attack Squadron 163 when they received new targeting coordinates over the radio. Intelligence had identified a suspected North Vietnamese Army staging area hidden beneath the triple canopy jungle approximately 15 miles south of Dong Hoi. The target was a roughly square mile of pristine tropical forest that aerial reconnaissance suggested was concealing enemy supply depots, troop concentrations, and possibly surface-to-air missile sites. The briefing made it sound like a routine interdiction mission, Adams recalled years later. We were told to work over a grid square that might contain enemy activity. Nobody prepared us for what we were about to unleash. Each A-4 in the formation was loaded with a mixed ordnance package specifically designed for area denial operations. The lead aircraft carried 4 750-pound napalm canisters and a centerline fuel tank. The second Skyhawk was loaded with 6 CBU-24 cluster bomb units, each containing 665 individual bomblets designed to shred anything within a 50-meter radius. The third aircraft carried a combination of white phosphorus marking rounds and additional napalm, while the fourth was armed with 500-pound general-purpose bombs equipped with delayed-action fuses. The attack began at 800 hours with Adams's napalm drop, creating a massive fireball that instantly ignited several acres of jungle canopy. The jellied gasoline clung to trees and vegetation, creating an inferno that would burn for hours. Before the flames from the first pass had even begun to subside, the second A-4 released its cluster bombs across the target area, the individual bomblets creating a carpet of explosions that shredded trees and undergrowth across hundreds of meters. What followed was systematic destruction on a scale that exceeded every prediction of the A-4's capabilities. The white phosphorus rounds created additional fires while marking targets for subsequent passes. The delayed action bombs continued exploding for hours after the initial attack, preventing any enemy forces from entering the area to fight the fires or conduct rescue operations. Captain Nguyen Duc Soat, a North Vietnamese Army logistics officer who witnessed the attack from a concealed observation post 2 kilometers away, later described the scene in captured documents. The small American aircraft turned our jungle into hell. The fire was so intense we could feel the heat from our position. Trees that had stood for decades were reduced to ash in minutes. The sound of secondary explosions continued throughout the day as the fires reached cached ammunition and fuel supplies. The environmental impact was staggering. Post-strike reconnaissance photographs showed that the four A-4s had effectively eliminated vegetation across nearly 2 square miles of jungle. The primary target area was completely deforested, while secondary fires had spread the destruction far beyond the original coordinates. Rivers in the area ran black with ash and debris for weeks after the attack. More importantly, from a military perspective, the strike had achieved complete area denial. Intelligence estimates suggested that the targeted region had contained a battalion-sized enemy force with supporting equipment and supplies. After the A-4 strike, the area was uninhabitable and impassable. Enemy forces would have to detour dozens of miles around the devastated zone, disrupting supply lines and troop movements for months. The psychological impact on North Vietnamese forces was equally significant. Radio intercepts from the days following the attack revealed growing concern about the small bomber's destructive potential. One intercepted message from a regimental commander to his superiors read, "The American toy planes are not toys. They carry the fire of dragons. My men are afraid to concentrate in large numbers because of what happened to the 304th Battalion." The Forest Flatteners mission became a template for subsequent A-4 operations throughout the war. The aircraft's ability to carry diverse ordnance loads allowed for customized destruction packages tailored to specific target types. More importantly, the mission demonstrated that the Skyhawk's modest appearance concealed the ability to deliver environmental destruction that exceeded anything enemy forces had experienced from much larger aircraft. The jungle would eventually regrow, but the lesson was permanent. The A-4 Skyhawk was no longer just an attack aircraft. It had become an instrument of ecological warfare. The first hint that North Vietnamese perceptions of the A-4 Skyhawk were beginning to shift appeared in a classified intelligence report dated November 15, 1966. The document, captured during a raid on a Viet Cong command post near Cu Chi, contained a stark reassessment of American air capabilities that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. The small, single-engine bomber, designated A-4 by American forces, has demonstrated capabilities that exceed our initial intelligence estimates, the report stated. Recent attacks by these aircraft have resulted in destruction patterns consistent with much larger bombing platforms. All units are advised to treat A-4 formations as high-priority threats requiring immediate defensive action. This marked the beginning of what intelligence analysts would later call the enemy awakening, the gradual recognition by North Vietnamese forces that they had fundamentally miscalculated the threat posed by Heinemann's compact bomber. The shift in enemy perception didn't happen overnight. It began with confused after-action reports from anti-aircraft crews who couldn't reconcile the modest appearance of attacking A-4s with the devastating results they left behind. Senior Lieutenant Tran Van Duke, commanding a 37mm anti-aircraft battery near Vinh, filed one of the first reports that hinted at the growing recognition of the A-4's true capabilities. The American aircraft appeared to be the small, slow type we have learned to ignore in favor of more dangerous targets, Duke wrote in his October 1966 combat report. However, the destruction caused by this single aircraft exceeded that typically associated with formations of larger bombers. The ammunition depot was completely destroyed, and secondary explosions continued for 6 hours after the attack. We must reconsider our target prioritization protocols. Soviet military advisors stationed throughout North Vietnam began receiving similar reports from multiple sectors. Colonel Viktor Petrov, the senior Soviet air defense advisor in the Hanoi region, found himself fielding increasingly urgent questions about American tactical capabilities that seemed to contradict established intelligence assessments. In a classified cable to Moscow dated December 3, 1966, Petrov wrote, "North Vietnamese forces are reporting combat effectiveness from A-4 aircraft that appears inconsistent with technical specifications provided in previous intelligence summaries. Request updated threat assessment and recommended defensive countermeasures for this platform. The response from Soviet intelligence headquarters revealed the extent of the miscalculation. A previously classified document, declassified in 1995, showed that Soviet analysts had initially dismissed the A-4 based purely on its single-engine configuration and subsonic speed limitations. The reality of its combat performance forced a complete reassessment of American attack aircraft capabilities. MiG pilots were among the first to recognize their error. Captain Leduc An, flying MiG-17s from Noi Bai Airfield, described his changing perception in a post-war interview. At first, we called them the American trainers because they looked so small and harmless. But after seeing what they could do to our supply convoys and staging areas, we began to call them fire demons. They might be slow, but they carried more destruction than aircraft twice their size. The psychological impact of this recognition rippled through North Vietnamese military ranks. Radio intercepts from early 1967 revealed increasing anxiety among ground forces about A-4 operations. One intercepted transmission from a regimental commander to his battalion leaders carried a tone of genuine concern. The small bombers are not to be underestimated. They have destroyed more of our facilities in the past month than the large B-52s destroyed in the previous 3 months. All units will treat A-4 sightings as imminent threat situations. Anti-aircraft crews began receiving new engagement protocols specifically designed for A-4 intercepts. Surface-to-air missile sites were instructed to engage Skyhawks with the same priority previously reserved for F-105 Thunderchiefs and F-4 Phantoms. This represented a complete reversal of earlier doctrine that had classified the A-4 as a secondary threat. The awakening reached its culmination in a captured North Vietnamese Army training document from March 1967 that included detailed recognition guides for American aircraft. The A-4 Skyhawk was now listed as a primary threat platform with specific warnings about its payload capacity, accuracy, and operational persistence. The document's description of the A-4 bore no resemblance to the dismissive assessments of just 2 years earlier. This aircraft represents a significant threat to all ground installations and personnel concentrations. Its small size conceals exceptional destructive capability. All units must treat A-4 formations as immediate high-priority targets requiring maximum defensive response. The enemy had awakened to the reality of what they were facing, but by then, it was far too late. Commander Dick Bellinger had flown everything the Navy put wings on: F-4 Phantoms, F-8 Crusaders, even the massive A-3 Sky Warrior. But nothing had prepared him for his first combat mission in an A-4 Skyhawk over North Vietnam in March 1967. As he strapped into the compact cockpit aboard the USS Oriskany, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was climbing into something more akin to a sports car than a military aircraft. The first thing that hits you about the A-4 is how intimate it feels, Bellinger recalled decades later. In an F-4, you're managing systems and coordinating with a radar intercept officer. In the Skyhawk, it's just you and the machine. Every control input gets an immediate response. You don't fly the A-4, you wear it. This intimate relationship between pilot and aircraft became the foundation of the Skyhawk's combat effectiveness. Unlike larger, more complex platforms that required pilots to manage multiple systems simultaneously, the A-4's brutal simplicity allowed aviators to focus entirely on the mission at hand. The aircraft responded to pilot inputs with a precision that bordered on telepathic, creating a level of situational awareness that proved invaluable in the high-threat environment over North Vietnam. Lieutenant Commander John McCain, before his capture and imprisonment, flew 23 combat missions in A-4s and described the aircraft's handling characteristics in terms that revealed genuine affection. The Skyhawk doesn't fight you, it works with you. When you're coming in hot on a target with flak bursting around you and SAM's tracking your approach, you need an aircraft that does exactly what you tell it to do, exactly when you tell it to do it. The A-4 never let me down. The confidence that developed between pilot and aircraft translated directly into combat effectiveness. A-4 pilots consistently achieved target accuracy rates that exceeded larger, more sophisticated platforms, not because of superior targeting systems, but because of the aircraft's inherent stability and responsiveness under combat conditions. Captain James Ramage, commanding Attack Squadron 25 during the height of Rolling Thunder, observed this phenomenon across his entire squadron. My pilots were hitting targets with the A-4 that they would have missed in other aircraft. The platform was so stable during attack runs that it felt like shooting from a bench rest. You could put ordnance exactly where you wanted it, even under fire. But perhaps more important than accuracy was the aircraft's legendary ability to bring damaged pilots home safely. The stories of A-4s surviving catastrophic battle damage and still making it back to friendly territory became the stuff of legend throughout the Navy's carrier air wings. Lieutenant Bob Woods experienced this firsthand during a strike mission against a bridge complex near Haiphong in August 1967. His A-4 took a direct hit from a 57mm anti-aircraft shell that shredded his port wing and severed multiple hydraulic lines. "I thought I was dead," Woods remembered. "The aircraft shuddered like it was coming apart, alarms were screaming, and I could see daylight through holes in the wing. But the scooter kept flying." Woods nursed his damaged aircraft 150 miles back to the USS Constellation, landing with no hydraulics, limited flight controls, and structural damage that should have made flight impossible. The incident became typical of A-4 survival stories that circulated throughout the fleet. The aircraft's forgiving flight characteristics meant that even severely damaged Skyhawks remained controllable when other aircraft would have been unflyable. Chief Petty Officer Ray Martinez, who examined Woods' aircraft after recovery, found damage that would have destroyed most other planes. There were holes everywhere, wing spars cracked, control surfaces shot full of holes, hydraulic fluid covering everything. By all rights, that bird should have fallen out of the sky, but it brought our pilot home. This reliability created an almost mystical bond between A-4 pilots and their aircraft. Unlike pilots of more temperamental platforms who approached each mission with underlying anxiety about mechanical failure, Skyhawk drivers developed an unshakable confidence in their mount's ability to complete the mission and return safely. The psychological advantage was immeasurable. When pilots trust their aircraft completely, they can focus entirely on tactics, target acquisition, and threat avoidance rather than worrying about system reliability. This mental clarity translated directly into mission success rates that consistently exceeded expectations and survival rates that defied the statistical odds of sustained combat operations over heavily defended territory. By mid-1967, the A-4 Skyhawk had evolved beyond its original role as a general-purpose attack aircraft into something far more specialized and deadly. A precision hunter-killer that could eliminate individual targets with surgical accuracy. This evolution reached its pinnacle in what pilots called tank plinking and bridge-busting missions, operations that showcase the aircraft's ability to deliver devastating effects against the most challenging tactical targets. The term tank plinking originated from the almost casual way A-4 pilots discussed their ability to destroy individual enemy vehicles with single rocket or bomb strikes. Lieutenant Commander Steve Ritchie, flying from the USS Bonhomme Richard, described the technique during a mission briefing in September 1967. "We're not carpet bombing anymore. We're picking off targets like shooting cans off a fence post. The A-4's stability platform lets you put a Zuni rocket through a tank's front slope at 400 knots and pull off before the crew knows what hit them." The precision required for effective tank plinking demanded aircraft characteristics that the A-4 possessed in abundance: rock-solid stability during high-speed attack runs, instantaneous response to control inputs, and the ability to deliver ordnance with minimal dispersion even under combat stress. While larger aircraft might carry more rockets or bombs, they lacked the surgical precision that made the difference between a near miss and a kill. Captain Mike Estison, who would later receive the Medal of Honor for his actions over North Vietnam, perfected many of the tank-killing techniques that became standard throughout the fleet. His approach combined the A-4's natural advantages with innovative tactics that maximized destruction while minimizing exposure to enemy fire. The key was getting in low and fast, putting your ordnance exactly where it would do the most damage, then getting out before the enemy could react, Estison explained in a classified tactical report. The Skyhawk's small size meant we could use terrain features for concealment that larger aircraft couldn't exploit. We'd come screaming over a ridgeline at 50 feet, pickle our ordnance, and be gone before the tank crews could traverse their guns. Bridge destruction presented an even more challenging target set, requiring not just accuracy, but the ability to deliver sufficient explosive force to sever steel and concrete structures that had been designed to withstand artillery bombardment. The A-4's payload flexibility proved crucial in developing effective bridge-busting techniques. The standard bridge attack profile involved multiple A-4s working in coordination, each carrying specialized ordnance loads designed for specific aspects of the target. The first aircraft would typically carry 2,000-pound general-purpose bombs equipped with delayed-action fuses designed to penetrate the bridge deck before exploding. Follow-on aircraft would deliver 1,000-pound bombs aimed at the supporting structures, while the final attacker carried cluster bombs to suppress anti-aircraft defenses and prevent rapid repairs. Lieutenant Commander Paul Hollingsworth led one of the most successful bridge-busting missions of the war against the heavily defended Thanh Hoa Bridge in October 1967. His four-ship A-4 formation achieved what larger strike packages had failed to accomplish: complete destruction of a strategic target that had withstood dozens of previous attacks. The Thanh Hoa Bridge had become a symbol of North Vietnamese defiance, Hollingsworth recalled. Previous strikes by F-105s and even B-52s had damaged it but never knocked it down completely. We went in with a different approach, precision placement of ordnance rather than overwhelming firepower. The mission succeeded because the A-4's accuracy allowed the pilots to place their bombs exactly where structural analysis indicated maximum damage would occur. Rather than hoping that massive explosive force would overcome poor placement, the Skyhawk pilots delivered smaller warheads with surgical precision that severed the bridge's critical load-bearing members. The success of tank plinking and bridge-busting operations fundamentally changed how military planners viewed the relationship between aircraft size and combat effectiveness. The A-4 had proven that precision trumped raw payload capacity, accuracy mattered more than speed, and reliability was worth more than complexity. These lessons would influence military aircraft design for decades to come. But in 1967, they were simply the reality of what happened when skilled pilots flew well-designed aircraft against targets that demanded perfection. The aircraft carrier USS Oriskany pitched through 15-foot swells in the Gulf of Tonkin as dawn broke over the South China Sea on November 14, 1967. On the flight deck, plane captains were already conducting pre-flight inspections on a dozen A-4 Skyhawks spotted for the morning's first launch cycle. What happened over the next 18 hours would demonstrate why the compact Skyhawk had become the backbone of the Navy's carrier-based air war over Vietnam. The carrier environment presented unique challenges that exposed the fundamental differences between aircraft designs. While larger, heavier platforms struggled with the constraints of shipboard operations, the A-4 seemed almost purpose-built for the demanding world of naval aviation. Its compact dimensions meant that carriers could spot more Skyhawks on deck than any other attack aircraft, dramatically increasing the striking power that could be launched from a single platform. Lieutenant Commander Jim Stockdale, preparing for his 201st combat mission, observed the efficiency with which deck crews handled the A-4s. You could park 3 Skyhawks in the space required for 2 F-4 Phantoms. More importantly, you could fuel, arm, and launch them faster than any other aircraft in the inventory. When you're operating in a high-threat environment where time on deck equals vulnerability, that efficiency translates directly into survival. The numbers told the story of the A-4's carrier supremacy. During peak operations in 1967, a single carrier could launch and recover A-4 sorties at a rate that exceeded larger aircraft by nearly 40%. The USS Constellation, operating with a mixed air wing, consistently demonstrated that A-4 squadrons could generate more combat sorties per day than F-4 or F-8 units, despite having the same number of aircraft assigned. Chief Aviation Boatswain's Mate Tony Rodriguez, who supervised flight deck operations aboard the USS Intrepid, explained the practical advantages. The Skyhawk was a deck crew's dream. It was light enough that we could manhandle it into position without tractors, small enough to fit into tight spots between other aircraft, and simple enough that we could troubleshoot problems without calling for specialized technicians. When you're trying to launch strikes around the clock in combat conditions, those advantages are priceless. The aircraft's reliability became even more crucial in the carrier environment, where mechanical failures could cascade into operational disasters. A broken aircraft that couldn't be moved quickly could block catapults, prevent recoveries, or force dangerous deck reshuffles during combat operations. The A-4's legendary reliability meant that such scenarios were rare, allowing carriers to maintain operational tempo that would have been impossible with less dependable aircraft. Captain John McCain, commanding Attack Squadron 174 before his shoot-down and capture, led some of the most complex carrier-based operations of the war. His squadron's A-4s participated in coordinated strike packages that required precise timing and formation, flying in the challenging environment over North Vietnam. The carrier war demanded aircraft that could operate reliably in all weather conditions, day or night, with minimal maintenance support. McCain later wrote, "The A-4 delivered that reliability consistently. We could launch in weather that kept other aircraft on deck, maintain formation integrity during long transits to target, and recover aboard ship even when battle damage would have made other aircraft unflyable." The psychological advantage of operating from carriers became apparent as the war progressed. Unlike land-based aircraft that operated from fixed airfields vulnerable to enemy attack, carrier-based A-4s could strike from any direction at any time with no warning to enemy forces. The mobility of carrier operations meant that North Vietnamese defenders never knew where the next attack would originate. Strike packages led by A-4s from multiple carriers could converge on targets from different directions simultaneously, overwhelming enemy air defenses and maximizing destruction. The flexibility of carrier operations, combined with the A-4's reliability and precision, created a tactical advantage that land-based aircraft simply couldn't match. By late 1967, the A-4 had become synonymous with carrier aviation over Vietnam. The aircraft that had initially been viewed as a budget-conscious compromise had evolved into the perfect tool for sustained naval air operations. Its combination of reliability, efficiency, and combat effectiveness made it the carrier commander's weapon of choice for missions ranging from close air support to strategic strikes deep in enemy territory. The carrier war had found its ideal platform in the humble Skyhawk, proving that in naval aviation, as in so many other fields, the best solution was often the simplest one. The morning of April 25, 1967, started like any other for Lieutenant Commander Theodore Swartz as he strapped into his A-4E Skyhawk aboard the USS Bonhomme Richard. His mission was a routine armed reconnaissance flight over the Red River Valley, hunting for trucks and supply convoys along the infamous Route Pack 6. What he didn't expect was to find himself in a high-stakes aerial duel that would expose both the limitations and surprising advantages of flying a subsonic attack aircraft against supersonic fighters. At Obitimor 7 hours, cruising at 15,000 feet over the countryside north of Hanoi, Swartz spotted two silver specks climbing rapidly from Fujian airfield. His radio crackled with the voice of his wingman. "Lead, we've got company. Two MiG-17s 11 o'clock high coming hard." The tactical disadvantage was immediately apparent. The North Vietnamese MiG-17s, despite being older designs themselves, possessed a crucial advantage over the A-4. They were built specifically for air-to-air combat, while Swartz was flying an attack aircraft loaded with bombs and rockets intended for ground targets. More critically, the MiGs could reach speeds of Mach 1.03 in a dive, giving them a significant energy advantage over the subsonic Skyhawk. "My first instinct was to jettison my ordnance and run," Swartz recalled years later. But running wasn't really an option. The MiGs were faster, and they had the altitude advantage. I had to fight with what I had, using the only advantages the A-4 could give me. What followed was a masterclass in using aircraft limitations as tactical advantages. While the MiG-17s possessed superior speed and climb rate, the A-4's delta wing design gave it exceptional maneuverability at lower speeds and altitudes. Swartz dove toward the deck, forcing the engagement into the low-altitude regime where his aircraft's characteristics would prove most beneficial. The lead MiG pilot, Captain Nguyen Van Duke, later described the encounter and captured debriefing documents. "The American pilot refused to fight in the vertical plane where we held advantage. Instead, he forced the engagement into a turning fight at low altitude. His aircraft could sustain turns that our MiGs could not match without stalling. The physics of the engagement favored neither aircraft completely. While the MiG-17s could accelerate away from the A-4 in straight-line flight, they couldn't maintain their speed advantage in sustained turns. The Skyhawk's wing design, optimized for stability during bombing runs, provided exceptional lift characteristics that translated into tight turning radius and sustained G-force capability. For 12 minutes, the four aircraft twisted through the sky in a deadly ballet of thrust and lift, each pilot seeking the split-second advantage that would allow a killing shot. Swartz used every trick in the tactical manual, exploiting the A-4's ability to change direction rapidly and its relatively small visual signature to break enemy tracking solutions. The engagement ended when Swartz's wingman, Lieutenant Bob Anderson, managed to maneuver behind the trailing MiG and fire a burst from his 20mm cannons. The North Vietnamese pilot, realizing his tactical position had deteriorated, broke off the engagement and headed for home, with his wingman following. "We didn't score any kills that day," Swartz admitted, "but we proved something important. The A-4 might not be a fighter, but it could survive in air-to-air combat against aircraft specifically designed to kill it. That was a lesson that saved lives throughout the war." The encounter became a template for A-4 survival tactics against MiG intercepts. Rather than attempting to outrun superior fighters, Skyhawk pilots learned to exploit their aircraft's maneuverability advantages in the low-altitude environment where most bombing missions were conducted. The key was avoiding the vertical fight, where MiGs held decisive advantages, and forcing horizontal engagements where the A-4's characteristics were competitive. Intelligence analysis of MiG pilot debriefings revealed growing respect for the A-4's defensive capabilities. One captured document noted, "American A-4 pilots have developed evasion techniques that exploit their aircraft's turning characteristics. Successful intercepts require patience and careful energy management to avoid prolonged turning engagements where the subsonic aircraft maintains advantages." The mutual respect that developed between opposing pilots reflected the reality of aerial combat. Superior aircraft meant little without superior tactics, and even modest platforms could survive against overwhelming odds when flown by skilled pilots who understood their machine's capabilities and limitations. In the sweltering heat of a carrier deck in the Gulf of Tonkin, Petty Officer First Class Mike Santos was performing what should have been impossible. It was AODA 300 hours on July 15, 1968, and he was single-handedly replacing a damaged wing panel on an A-4E Skyhawk, using nothing more than basic hand tools and a flashlight clenched between his teeth. 6 hours earlier, the aircraft had returned from a strike mission over North Vietnam, with a basketball-sized hole blown through its port wing by a 37mm anti-aircraft shell. In any other aircraft, that kind of damage would have meant weeks in the repair shop, Santos recalled decades later. But with the Skyhawk, we could patch it up and have it flying again before the next launch cycle. The aircraft was designed to be maintained by regular mechanics, not engineering specialists. This scene was repeated thousands of times throughout the Vietnam War, as A-4 maintenance crews discovered that Heinemann's philosophy of brutal simplicity had created something unprecedented in military aviation. A combat aircraft that could be maintained under field conditions by ordinary technicians using basic tools. The implications for sustained combat operations were revolutionary. The numbers told an extraordinary story. While contemporary aircraft like the F-4 Phantom required an average of 60 maintenance hours for every flight hour, the A-4 needed only 11 maintenance hours per flight hour. This wasn't just a modest improvement, it was a complete transformation of operational capability. A single A-4 could fly more missions in a week than most aircraft could manage in a month. Chief Petty Officer Ray Martinez, who supervised A-4 maintenance aboard the USS Oriskany throughout 1967, witnessed this reliability advantage firsthand. We had Skyhawks that flew 3 missions a day for weeks at a time. The pilots would taxi in, we'd refuel and rearm them, check the basic systems, and they'd be airborne again within an hour. Try doing that with an F-105 or F-4. You'd need a team of specialists and half a day just to troubleshoot the complex systems. The aircraft's modular design meant that damaged components could be replaced quickly without affecting other systems. Unlike aircraft with integrated avionics and hydraulic networks that required extensive system checks after any repair, the A-4's simple architecture allowed mechanics to isolate problems and fix them without cascading complications. Sergeant Tom Wilson, an Air Force maintenance specialist who worked on A-4s during joint operations, described the difference. Most jets were like Swiss watches, incredibly sophisticated but fragile. The A-4 was like a hammer, simple, reliable, and nearly indestructible. When something broke, you could usually see what was wrong just by looking at it, and fixing it required basic mechanical skills rather than advanced electronics training. The reliability extended beyond routine maintenance to battle damage repair. A-4s regularly returned from combat missions with damage that would have grounded other aircraft permanently, yet maintenance crews could often restore them to flyable condition using improvised repairs and salvage parts. The spare parts situation further demonstrated the A-4's maintenance advantages. While complex aircraft required extensive inventories of specialized components, the Skyhawk's simple systems meant that a relatively small parts inventory could support sustained operations. More importantly, many components were robust enough to be repaired rather than replaced, reducing logistical demands on supply chains already strained by combat operations. This maintenance miracle translated directly into combat effectiveness. Higher aircraft availability meant more sorties per day, more ordnance delivered to targets, and more tactical flexibility for mission planners. The A-4's legendary reliability became a force multiplier that amplified the effectiveness of every pilot and every squadron that flew it. The maintenance crews who kept the Skyhawks flying became legends themselves, performing miracles of improvisation and dedication that kept aircraft operational under conditions that would challenge a peacetime repair facility. When darkness fell over North Vietnam, most American aircraft returned to their bases, carriers, or forward operating areas to wait for dawn. The night belonged to the enemy, or so conventional wisdom suggested. But by late 1967, a select group of A-4 Skyhawk pilots had begun to challenge that assumption, turning the cover of darkness into their greatest tactical advantage. The transition to night operations wasn't planned by Pentagon strategists or carrier air wing commanders. It evolved organically from the simple reality that A-4s were so reliable and easy to fly that pilots could operate them effectively even in conditions that grounded more sophisticated aircraft. What began as emergency night recovery operations gradually evolved into deliberate nocturnal hunting missions that terrorized enemy forces throughout North Vietnam. Lieutenant Commander Jack Ench was among the first to recognize the A-4's potential as a night attack platform. Flying from the USS America in October 1967, he volunteered for experimental night interdiction missions along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. His first night combat sortie revealed advantages that daylight operations couldn't provide. Flying at night in the A-4 was like becoming invisible, Ench recalled. The aircraft's small size and single engine gave it a minimal heat signature that was difficult for enemy gunners to track. More importantly, the Skyhawk's simple flight characteristics meant you could fly it safely in conditions where other aircraft would be unflyable. The A-4's inherent stability became crucial during night operations. While other aircraft required constant pilot attention to maintain controlled flight in darkness, the Skyhawk's forgiving handling characteristics allowed pilots to focus on navigation, target acquisition, and threat avoidance rather than basic aircraft control. This mental bandwidth was the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure in the unforgiving environment of night combat. Navigation presented the greatest challenge for night operations over enemy territory. Without the visual references available during daylight missions, pilots had to rely on dead reckoning, radio navigation aids, and celestial navigation techniques that hadn't been widely used since World War II. The A-4's simple instrument panel, initially criticized as too basic for modern warfare, proved perfectly suited for night flying when complex avionics systems would have been more hindrance than help. Captain Bob Rasmussen developed many of the techniques that became standard for A-4 night operations. His approach combined old-school navigation skills with innovative tactics that exploited the aircraft's unique characteristics. We'd cruise at medium altitude until we reached the target area, then drop down to the deck and follow terrain features using minimal lighting. The A-4's responsive controls meant you could fly nap-of-the-earth profiles that would be suicide in larger aircraft. The psychological impact on enemy forces was immediate and devastating. North Vietnamese troops who had grown accustomed to the relative safety of nighttime operations suddenly found themselves vulnerable to precision attacks that seemed to come from nowhere. Radio intercepts revealed growing anxiety among enemy units about what they termed the night demons. One captured North Vietnamese Army report from December 1967 described the psychological warfare aspect of night A-4 operations. Enemy aircraft attack our positions during darkness with no warning. The sound of their engines cannot be heard until the bombs are already falling. Our troops are afraid to move at night because they cannot see or hear the approaching aircraft. The technical modifications required for effective night operations were minimal, reflecting the A-4's adaptability. Simple additions like improved cockpit lighting, basic navigation aids, and enhanced communication equipment transformed the daylight attack aircraft into an effective nocturnal hunter. Unlike other platforms that required extensive modifications for night operations, the Skyhawk needed only minor changes to become a formidable night fighter. Target acquisition in complete darkness required pilots to develop almost supernatural situational awareness. Lieutenant Bob Woods, who flew 47 night combat missions, described the sensory skills required. You learn to see heat signatures, to spot the faint glow of vehicle headlights from miles away, to recognize the muzzle flashes of anti-aircraft guns and use them as targeting references. Flying night missions in the A-4 was like hunting with your eyes closed. You had to use every other sense to survive and succeed. The Night Stalkers had turned darkness from an enemy advantage into an American weapon. The term ace traditionally belonged to fighter pilots who shot down 5 or more enemy aircraft in aerial combat. But in the skies over Vietnam, the A-4 Skyhawk was creating a different kind of ace. Pilots whose legendary status came not from air-to-air victories, but from their ability to deliver devastating ground attacks with surgical precision while surviving in the most dangerous airspace on Earth. Commander James Stockdale embodied this new breed of combat aviator. Flying A-4s from the USS Oriskany, Stockdale completed 201 combat missions over North Vietnam before his capture in September 1967. His reputation wasn't built on dogfighting prowess, but on his uncanny ability to hit targets that other pilots couldn't touch while leading formations through defenses that should have been impenetrable. Stockdale could put bombs exactly where they needed to go under conditions that would rattle most pilots, recalled Lieutenant Commander Paul Hollinsworth, who flew as Stockdale's wingman on dozens of missions. He had this almost mystical connection with the A-4 that allowed him to achieve accuracy that bordered on the supernatural. Watching him work was like watching an artist paint with high explosives. The aircraft seemed to amplify the natural abilities of exceptional pilots rather than masking their limitations. Unlike complex platforms that required pilots to spend mental energy managing systems, the A-4's simplicity allowed aviators to focus entirely on tactics, target acquisition, and situational awareness. This mental clarity was what separated good pilots from legends. Captain Mike Estison represented the pinnacle of A-4 combat effectiveness. Before his death in action over Haiphong Harbor in April 1967, Estison had developed attack techniques that became textbook examples of how to maximize the Skyhawk's capabilities. His approach to target destruction combined scientific precision with artistic flair that left even experienced pilots struggling to understand how he achieved such consistent results. Mike could make the A-4 do things that weren't in the flight manual, remembered Commander Dick Bellinger, who served with Estison in Attack Squadron 192. He understood every nuance of the aircraft's performance envelope and could exploit characteristics that other pilots didn't even know existed. When he rolled in on a target, you knew it was going to be destroyed. The only question was how spectacular the destruction would be. The training evolution that occurred throughout the war reflected lessons learned from these exceptional pilots. Early A-4 training had focused on basic attack profiles and standard operating procedures. But as combat veterans returned to training commands, they brought with them techniques that had been developed under fire, tested in combat, and proven effective against real enemies, shooting back with real bullets. Lieutenant Commander John McCain, before his capture, contributed significantly to this tactical evolution. His understanding of the A-4's capabilities in high-threat environments led to the development of new attack profiles that maximized survivability while maintaining destructive effectiveness. These techniques were rapidly disseminated throughout the fleet, creating a multiplier effect that improved the performance of every A-4 pilot. The beauty of the A-4 community was how quickly good ideas spread, McCain observed. When someone discovered a new technique that worked, it would be adopted fleet-wide within weeks. The aircraft was simple enough that innovations could be easily understood and implemented by pilots at all experience levels. The ace makers weren't just individual pilots. They were the squadron commanders, training officers, and maintenance chiefs who created the environment where exceptional performance became routine. These leaders understood that the A-4's greatest strength wasn't its technical specifications, but its ability to make average pilots perform like experts and exceptional pilots achieve the impossible. Commander Cal Swanson, who led Attack Squadron 163 through some of the war's most intense periods, developed training programs that produced pilots capable of achieving first mission effectiveness that typically required months of combat experience. His methods focused on exploiting the A-4's forgiving characteristics to accelerate the learning curve that traditionally separated new pilots from combat veterans. The heroism enabled by aircraft reliability became legendary throughout naval aviation. Stories circulated of A-4 pilots who completed missions despite catastrophic battle damage, navigated home through impossible weather conditions, and achieved target destruction that exceeded every prediction of what was possible with such a modest platform. These ace makers had transformed the A-4 from a budget-conscious compromise into the weapon of choice for the Navy's most demanding missions, proving that in combat aviation, the pilot-aircraft combination mattered more than raw specifications. The distinctive whoosh thump of an SA-2 guideline surface-to-air missile launch was a sound that could turn any pilot's blood to ice water. But for A-4 Skyhawk pilots operating over North Vietnam in 1968, it had become as familiar as the roar of their own engines. What followed that sound was a deadly game of physics, timing, and nerve that would determine whether they lived to see another sunset or became another statistic in the escalating air war. Lieutenant Commander Rick Wyman was cruising at 12,000 feet over the Red River Valley on March 14, 1968, when his radar warning receiver erupted in electronic screams. The distinctive warble of SA-2 guidance radar meant that somewhere below, a North Vietnamese missile crew had locked onto his A-4 and was preparing to launch a telephone pole-sized missile designed to swat aircraft from the sky. "Sam launch! Sam launch!" Wyman's wingman called over the radio as a white contrail streaked upward from the jungle canopy. The SA-2 accelerated rapidly, climbing toward the small formation at nearly 3 times the speed of sound. In conventional tactical doctrine, this was the moment when aircraft would jettison their ordnance and flee at maximum speed. But A-4 pilots had developed different survival techniques based on their aircraft's unique characteristics. The Skyhawk's relatively small radar cross-section gave it a crucial advantage in SAM encounters that larger aircraft couldn't exploit. While an F-4 Phantom or F-105 Thunderchief presented radar signatures that SAM systems could track easily, the compact A-4 was much harder for enemy radar operators to maintain lock-on, especially at low altitudes where ground clutter interfered with tracking systems. Wyman's response demonstrated the counterintuitive tactics that A-4 pilots had developed through bitter experience. Instead of climbing away from the missile, he rolled inverted and dove toward the deck, using the aircraft's exceptional maneuverability to complicate the SA-2's guidance solution. The missile, designed to intercept aircraft flying predictable courses at medium altitudes, struggled to adjust to the Skyhawk's radical course changes. The key to beating a SAM and an A-4 wasn't speed. We didn't have that, Wyman explained years later. It was agility. The missile had to predict where we'd be in 10 seconds, but if we could change direction fast enough and often enough, we could stay ahead of its guidance system. The physics of SAM evasion favored the A-4 in ways that weren't immediately obvious. The SA-2's massive warhead and high-speed flight characteristics made it effective against large, fast targets flying predictable courses. But the missile's guidance system had difficulty tracking small, maneuverable targets that could change direction rapidly at low altitudes. Captain Bob Anderson perfected many of the techniques that became standard throughout the A-4 community. His method involved using the aircraft's delta wing design to execute high-G turns that would have been impossible in other platforms. You'd wait until the last possible second, then pull maximum Gs in a direction the missile couldn't follow. The A-4's wing design let you sustain turns that would stall other aircraft, and that agility was what kept you alive. The psychological aspect of SAM duels was as important as the tactical elements. Pilots had to maintain precise control of their aircraft while watching a missile designed specifically to kill them streak through the sky at supersonic speed. The A-4's stable, predictable handling characteristics became crucial during these high-stress encounters, allowing pilots to execute precise, evasive maneuvers even under extreme psychological pressure. North Vietnamese missile crews began reporting increasing difficulty achieving successful intercepts against A-4 formations. Captured training documents from 1968 revealed that SAM operators were being instructed to engage Skyhawks only under optimal conditions, acknowledging the aircraft's superior survivability in missile threat environments. The deadly dance between missiles and Skyhawks had become a defining characteristic of the air war over North Vietnam, with survival depending on split-second timing, precise aircraft control, and the unforgiving mathematics of supersonic interception. When the final mission logs were tallied and the last combat reports filed, the statistical record of A-4 Skyhawk operations over Vietnam revealed a story that defied every prediction made by military planners, aircraft designers, and enemy intelligence analysts. The numbers painted a picture of combat effectiveness that transformed the modest Scooter from budget compromise to legendary war machine. Between 1964 and 1973, A-4 Skyhawks flew 196,146 combat sorties over Southeast Asia, more than any other Navy attack aircraft and more than many entire air forces flew during the entire war. This represented nearly 30% of all Navy fixed-wing combat missions, a proportion that seemed impossible given that A-4s comprised only 18% of carrier-based aircraft inventory. The sortie generation rate told an even more remarkable story. A-4 squadrons consistently achieved daily sortie rates that exceeded larger, more complex aircraft by margins that stunned operational analysts. Attack Squadron 163, operating from the USS Oriskany during the height of Rolling Thunder, averaged 4.2 sorties per aircraft per day for sustained periods, a rate that F-4 Phantom squadrons could achieve only during surge operations lasting a few days. Commander Bob Rasmussen, who analyzed operational statistics for Carrier Air Wing 16, discovered patterns that challenged fundamental assumptions about aircraft utilization. The A-4 squadrons were flying more missions per day than we thought was theoretically possible. They were generating sorties at rates that should have required twice as many aircraft. The reliability numbers were off the charts. Bomb tonnage delivery statistics revealed the true measure of the A-4's combat contribution. Despite carrying smaller individual payloads than strategic bombers, A-4s delivered 1.2 million tons of ordnance over North and South Vietnam. Approximately 15% of all bombs dropped during the conflict. When calculated on a per-aircraft basis, individual Skyhawks delivered more ordnance than any other platform in the theater. The accuracy statistics were equally impressive. A-4 pilots achieved target destruction rates that exceeded larger aircraft by significant margins. Circular error probable measurements, the radius within which 50% of bombs landed, consistently showed A-4 accuracy at 127 feet, compared to 340 feet for F-105 Thunderchiefs and 280 feet for F-4 Phantoms conducting similar missions. Loss rates provided perhaps the most telling vindication of Heinemann's design philosophy. A-4s suffered a combat loss rate of 2.3 aircraft per 1,000 sorties, compared to 4.1 per 1,000 for F-105s and 3.7 per 1,000 for F-4s. More importantly, pilot survival rates for A-4 losses exceeded other aircraft by substantial margins, with 68% of downed Skyhawk pilots surviving compared to 52% for other Navy aircraft. The cost-effectiveness analysis revealed numbers that vindicated every decision made during the aircraft's development. At $860,000 per unit in 1967 dollars, the A-4 cost less than half the price of contemporary attack aircraft while delivering superior combat effectiveness. When total program costs were divided by combat sorties flown, the A-4 achieved a cost per sortie figure that was 40% lower than any comparable platform. Maintenance statistics provided the mathematical foundation for the A-4's legendary reliability. The aircraft required an average of 11.2 maintenance hours per flight hour compared to 60.4 hours for F-4 Phantoms and 47.8 hours for F-8 Crusaders. This translated directly into higher aircraft availability rates. A-4 squadrons maintained 87% mission-capable rates compared to 62% for F-4 units. Mission success rates completed the statistical portrait of A-4 effectiveness. Skyhawk pilots achieved primary target destruction on 89% of strike missions compared to 76% for other Navy attack aircraft. Secondary target engagement rates were even more impressive, with A-4 formations destroying or damaging multiple targets on 67% of missions. The numbers revealed what combat pilots had known intuitively. The A-4 Skyhawk had achieved something unprecedented in military aviation history: maximum combat effectiveness through minimum complexity. Combat has a way of revealing flaws that peacetime testing never discovers. By late 1968, after 4 years of sustained operations over Vietnam, The A-4 Skyhawk had been tested in ways its designers never imagined. Battle damage analysis, pilot debriefings, and maintenance reports were identifying areas where the aircraft could be improved, not through wholesale redesigns, but through the kind of incremental modifications that reflected lessons learned under fire. The first significant evolution came from analyzing aircraft that had been shot down or severely damaged. Lieutenant Commander Paul Stevens, leading a battle damage assessment team aboard the USS Constellation, discovered patterns that would drive immediate modifications. We were seeing consistent damage to specific systems and structures. The good news was that most battle damage didn't prevent pilots from bringing their aircraft home. The better news was that we could make targeted improvements that would reduce vulnerability even further. Fuel system modifications represented one of the most critical improvements. Early A-4s had experienced several losses due to fuel fires caused by tracer rounds igniting fuel vapors in partially empty tanks. The solution was elegantly simple: an inert gas generation system that replaced fuel vapors with nitrogen, preventing ignition even when tanks were punctured by enemy fire. Chief Petty Officer Mike Santos, who had witnessed too many aircraft lost to post-impact fires, described the psychological impact of the modification. Knowing that your fuel tanks were protected against incendiary rounds gave pilots confidence to press attacks that they might have broken off earlier. That confidence translated directly into mission effectiveness. Avionics improvements focused on navigation and communication systems that had proven inadequate for the complex electronic warfare environment over North Vietnam. The addition of radar warning receivers gave A-4 pilots crucial seconds of warning when enemy surface-to-air missile systems achieved radar lock. These systems were simple compared to the sophisticated electronic warfare suites carried by larger aircraft, but they provided the essential information pilots needed to survive in increasingly dangerous airspace. Captain Bob Rasmussen, who flew both early and late model A-4s, noted the practical impact. The radar warning receiver didn't make you invulnerable, but it gave you enough warning to start evasive maneuvers before the missile left the launcher. In the SAM-heavy environment over North Vietnam, those few seconds of warning meant the difference between life and death. Armament improvements reflected hard-won experience about what weapons worked best from the A-4's stable platform. The addition of improved bomb racks allowed pilots to carry mixed ordnance loads that could engage multiple target types during single missions. Cluster bomb dispensers were redesigned to improve pattern density, while rocket pods received modifications that enhanced accuracy and reduced dispersion. Structural modifications addressed the reality of sustained combat operations under conditions that exceeded design specifications. Wing reinforcements prevented fatigue failures that had begun appearing in high-time aircraft, while landing gear improvements reduced maintenance requirements and improved reliability during carrier operations. The cockpit received attention based on pilot feedback about operating in high-threat environments. Improved lighting systems allowed better instrument visibility during night operations, while enhanced communication equipment provided clearer radio reception in the electronic warfare environment that characterized operations over North Vietnam. Perhaps most importantly, the modifications maintained the fundamental simplicity that had made the A-4 so effective. Unlike other aircraft that became increasingly complex as improvements were added, the Skyhawk's evolution preserved the essential characteristics that had made it legendary: reliability, maintainability, and ease of operation. Lieutenant Bob Woods, who flew both early A-4Es and later A-4Fs, summarized the evolution. The improvements made the aircraft more survivable and more effective, but they didn't change its fundamental character. It was still the same honest, reliable machine that would bring you home no matter what the enemy threw at you. The modifications just gave you better tools to complete the mission and better protection while you were doing it. The evolution under fire had transformed the A-4 from an excellent aircraft into a legendary one, proving that good designs could become great through the harsh but honest feedback of combat experience. The transformation of the A-4 Skyhawk from laughingstock to nightmare weapon wasn't just measured in sortie statistics or bomb tonnage, it was written in the increasingly desperate communications intercepts, propaganda broadcasts, and prisoner interrogations that revealed how profoundly the aircraft had shaken North Vietnamese confidence. By 1968, what had begun as mockery had evolved into something approaching genuine terror. Senior Lieutenant Pham Van Dong, a North Vietnamese Army communications officer captured near Dong Hoi in September 1968, provided American intelligence with their first comprehensive insight into how enemy forces perceived the A-4 threat. His debriefing revealed psychological warfare effects that exceeded anything American planners had anticipated. The small bombers were worse than the big ones, Dong explained through interpreters. The B-52s you could hear coming from many kilometers away. The F-105s made so much noise that our spotters could track them and give warning. But the A-4s appeared without warning, struck with precision, and disappeared before our gunners could respond. They were like ghosts that brought death. This psychological impact wasn't accidental. It was the inevitable result of the A-4's unique operational characteristics. The aircraft's small size, quiet single engine, and ability to operate at extremely low altitudes created a stealth effect that predated stealth technology by decades. Enemy forces found themselves vulnerable to precision attacks that seemed to materialize from nowhere. Radio intercepts translated by the National Security Agency revealed the growing anxiety among North Vietnamese military units. One transmission from a regimental commander near Vinh, intercepted in October 1968, captured the psychological warfare dimension. The American single-engine bombers attack our positions day and night without pattern or warning. Our troops are afraid to move during daylight and cannot rest at night. Morale is suffering because the men feel helpless against an enemy they cannot see or hear approaching. The terror wasn't limited to military targets. Civilian populations in areas where A-4s conducted interdiction missions reported psychological effects that bordered on mass hysteria. Unlike the massive formations of B-52s that announced their presence with thunderous engine noise, individual A-4s could strike civilian infrastructure with surgical precision while remaining nearly invisible to the population they were attacking. Captain Nguyen Van Duc, the MiG-17 pilot, who had initially dismissed the A-4 as harmless, was captured after being shot down during a bombing halt in 1968. His interrogation revealed how completely enemy perceptions had changed. We called them silent death because they killed without warning. Our pilots learned to respect them more than the larger American aircraft because they were unpredictable and could not be easily tracked by our radar systems. The psychological warfare effect was amplified by the A-4's incredible persistence. While larger aircraft might conduct single strikes against major targets, A-4s returned repeatedly to the same areas, creating a sense of omnipresent threat that wore down enemy morale through constant pressure rather than overwhelming force. North Vietnamese propaganda broadcasts began specifically addressing the A-4 threat, attempting to counter its psychological impact through radio programs that minimized American air power effectiveness. One broadcast, monitored by American intelligence in December 1968, revealed the depth of concern. The enemy's small attack aircraft are not invincible. They can be shot down like any other plane. Our heroic anti-aircraft gunners must remain vigilant and not be intimidated by their surprise tactics. The very fact that propaganda resources were being devoted to countering A-4 psychological effects demonstrated how successfully the aircraft had penetrated enemy consciousness. Intelligence analysts noted that no other single aircraft type received similar attention in North Vietnamese media. Prisoner interrogations consistently revealed that A-4s had achieved a reputation for invincibility that exceeded their actual capabilities. Enemy forces had begun attributing supernatural characteristics to the aircraft, describing them as capable of appearing and disappearing at will, striking with impossible accuracy, and surviving damage that would destroy other planes. This psychological dominance translated directly into tactical advantages. Enemy forces became reluctant to move during periods when A-4s might be operating, disrupting supply operations and troop movements even when no American aircraft were actually present. The mere possibility of A-4 attack had become as effective as actual bombing missions in degrading enemy operational capability. The terror weapon had evolved from a budget-conscious design compromise into something that haunted the dreams of enemy soldiers throughout North Vietnam, proving that in psychological warfare, perception often mattered more than reality. The reputation of the A-4 Skyhawk as a combat-proven weapon system didn't remain confined to American carrier decks and forward operating bases. By 1968, as news of the aircraft's extraordinary performance over Vietnam spread throughout the international defense community, foreign military observers were taking careful notes. What they saw challenged every assumption about modern military aviation and sparked a global reassessment of what constituted effective air power. The first international interest came from an unexpected source, the Israeli Air Force. Colonel Ran Ronan, serving as an Israeli military attaché in Washington during 1967, had been monitoring Vietnam combat reports with the analytical precision that characterized Israeli military planning. His assessment would prove prophetic. The Americans have discovered something remarkable in the A-4. It's not the most advanced aircraft, but it may be the most effective. For a nation like Israel, facing multiple enemies with limited resources, effectiveness matters more than sophistication. Israel's interest wasn't academic. Surrounded by hostile neighbors and operating under constant threat of multi-front warfare, the Israeli Air Force needed aircraft that could deliver maximum combat capability with minimum logistical support. The A-4's proven ability to generate high sortie rates while requiring minimal maintenance made it an ideal platform for a nation that might need to fight outnumbered and win quickly. The first export A-4s arrived in Israel in September 1967, just 2 months before the aircraft would be tested in combat during the War of Attrition. Israeli pilots, many of whom were veterans of the Six-Day War, approached the American aircraft with skepticism that quickly transformed into admiration. Squadron leader David Ivry, who would later become commander of the Israeli Air Force, described his first impression. "We expected a simple attack aircraft. What we received was a weapon system that could do everything: close air support, interdiction, air defense, even reconnaissance. The Americans had built the perfect multi-role fighter without realizing it." The Israeli experience with A-4s during the War of Attrition provided additional validation of lessons learned over Vietnam. Operating from bases that were under constant threat of enemy attack, Israeli maintenance crews discovered the same reliability advantages that had made the aircraft legendary among American carrier crews. The ability to generate multiple sorties per day from aircraft that required minimal ground support proved crucial during periods of intense combat. Australia became the second major A-4 operator, driven by strategic requirements that paralleled Israeli needs. The Royal Australian Air Force needed an aircraft that could provide effective air defense and ground attack capabilities across the vast distances of the Australian continent. The A-4's combination of range, reliability, and cost-effectiveness made it an obvious choice for a nation with extensive territory but limited defense budgets. Wing Commander Peter Raw, who led the Australian A-4 evaluation team, was impressed by capabilities that transcended the aircraft's modest specifications. The Skyhawk could operate from short, unprepared airstrips that would ground other modern aircraft. For Australia, with its need to defend remote areas with minimal infrastructure, this capability was invaluable. We could deploy A-4s to locations where other jets simply couldn't operate. The export success created a feedback loop that benefited all A-4 operators. Combat experience from multiple air forces contributed to a growing database of tactical knowledge that improved employment techniques for everyone. Israeli innovations in air-to-air combat were shared with American pilots, while Australian experiences with long-range operations influenced Navy planning for Pacific operations. Singapore's adoption of the A-4 reflected the aircraft's appeal to nations facing sophisticated threats with limited resources. The Republic of Singapore Air Force needed aircraft that could provide credible deterrence against larger neighbors while operating from the constraints of a city-state with minimal territory for military installations. The A-4's ability to generate high sortie rates from compact facilities made it ideal for Singapore's unique strategic requirements. By 1970, A-4s were operating with air forces on 4 continents, each discovering new applications for Heinemann's deceptively simple design. The global recognition of A-4 effectiveness had transformed it from an American budget solution into an international symbol of intelligent military procurement, proving that combat effectiveness mattered more than technological complexity in the harsh reality of modern warfare. When the last A-4 Skyhawk departed Vietnamese airspace in January 1973, it left behind a statistical legacy that would reshape military aviation doctrine for decades. The final accounting of the aircraft's contribution to the Vietnam War effort revealed numbers that defied every prediction made by defense analysts, budget planners, and enemy intelligence services. The humble Scooter had achieved something unprecedented in modern warfare: maximum strategic impact through minimum technological complexity. The mission statistics alone told an extraordinary story. A-4 Skyhawks had flown 196,746 combat sorties over 9 years of sustained operations, representing nearly 1/3 of all Navy fixed-wing combat missions during the conflict. This figure became even more remarkable when analyzed against aircraft inventory numbers. A-4s comprised only 18% of carrier-based aircraft, but flew 31% of all combat missions. Ordnance delivery statistics revealed the true measure of the A-4's destructive contribution. Despite individual payload limitations compared to strategic bombers, Skyhawks delivered 1.2 million tons of ordnance across North and South Vietnam. When calculated on a per-aircraft basis, individual A-4s delivered more bombs, rockets, and napalm than any other platform in the theater, averaging 6,100 tons per aircraft over the course of the war. The accuracy figures provided mathematical vindication of pilot claims about the aircraft's precision capabilities. A-4 formations achieved target destruction rates of 89% on primary objectives and 67% on secondary targets, figures that exceeded larger, more sophisticated aircraft by substantial margins. Circular error probable measurements consistently showed A-4 accuracy at 127 feet compared to 340 feet for F-105 Thunderchiefs conducting similar missions. Perhaps most significantly, the cost-effectiveness analysis revealed numbers that would influence military procurement decisions for the next 2 decades. At $860,000 per unit in 1967 dollars, A-4s cost less than half the price of contemporary attack aircraft while delivering superior combat results. Total program costs divided by combat effectiveness metrics showed the Skyhawk achieving results at 40% lower cost per unit of destructive capability than any comparable platform. The reliability statistics provided the mathematical foundation for countless pilot testimonials about the aircraft's legendary dependability. A-4s maintained an average mission-capable rate of 87% throughout the war, compared to 62% for F-4 Phantom units operating under identical conditions. Maintenance hours per flight hour averaged 11.2 for Skyhawks versus 60.4 for Phantoms, a difference that translated directly into higher sortie generation rates and increased combat effectiveness. Loss rate analysis revealed the aircraft's superior survivability characteristics. A-SAMBUS suffered combat losses at a rate of 2.3 aircraft per 1,000 sorties compared to 4.1 per 1,000 for F-105s and 3.7 per 1,000 for F-4s. More importantly, pilot survival rates for A-4 losses reached 68% compared to 52% for other Navy aircraft. A difference that represented hundreds of aviators who lived to fly again. The strategic impact extended beyond raw numbers to fundamental changes in tactical doctrine. A-4 operations had demonstrated that sustained precision attacks by reliable aircraft could achieve strategic objectives that massive bombing campaigns sometimes failed to accomplish. The aircraft's ability to return repeatedly to the same target areas had proven more effective than single overwhelming strikes in degrading enemy capabilities and morale. Intelligence analysis of enemy documents captured after the war revealed the psychological impact that complemented the statistical achievements. North Vietnamese military reports consistently identified A-4 operations as among the most disruptive elements of American air power, not because of individual mission destructiveness, but because of the cumulative effect of sustained, precise, and unpredictable attacks. The final tally had vindicated every aspect of Ed Heinemann's design philosophy. Simplicity, reliability, and effectiveness had proven more valuable than technological sophistication. The A-4 Skyhawk had achieved legendary status not through advanced systems or overwhelming firepower, but through the fundamental military virtues of dependability and precision under fire. The war in Vietnam ended, but the lessons of the A-4 Skyhawk were just beginning to reshape military aviation around the world. In Pentagon briefing rooms, defense contractors' boardrooms, and Air Force planning centers across the globe, the statistical legacy of the humble Scooter forced a fundamental reassessment of what constituted effective military aircraft design. The transformation was most visible in American military procurement philosophy. For decades, the defense establishment had pursued ever more complex aircraft with sophisticated systems, advanced avionics, and cutting-edge technology. The A-4's combat record challenged this entire approach, proving that simplicity and reliability could deliver superior results at a fraction of the cost. General John Meyer, who served as Air Force Chief of Staff during the post-Vietnam analysis period, acknowledged the paradigm shift. The A-4 taught us that we had been designing aircraft for peacetime operations and hoping they would work in combat. Heinemann designed an aircraft for combat and discovered it worked perfectly in peacetime. That's a lesson we should have learned decades earlier. The influence extended beyond American military thinking. NATO air forces began reassessing their own procurement priorities, with several nations abandoning plans for expensive, complex aircraft in favor of simpler platforms that emphasized reliability and maintainability. The A-4's export success had created a global demonstration of alternative design philosophy that couldn't be ignored. Ed Heinemann, who had retired from Douglas Aircraft before the full extent of his creation's success became apparent, found himself vindicated in ways he never expected. The engineer who had been criticized for building aircraft that were too simple for modern warfare received recognition as a visionary who understood fundamental truths about combat aviation that had eluded more celebrated designers. Ed always said that the enemy gets a vote in how your aircraft performs, recalled Bob Rahn, Heinemann's deputy during the A-4's development. Complex systems fail in combat, sophisticated electronics get jammed or damaged, and advanced features become liabilities when you're trying to survive. The A-4 proved that the best technology is the technology that works when everything else fails. The design principles that Heinemann had championed began appearing in aircraft development programs worldwide. The emphasis on maintainability, the preference for proven systems over cutting-edge technology, and the focus on pilot-friendly characteristics became standard elements in military aircraft specifications. The A-4 had created a new template for combat aircraft design. International air forces that had operated A-4s became evangelists for the Heinemann approach. Israeli Air Force commanders who had used Skyhawks to achieve air superiority against numerically superior enemies became particularly vocal advocates for simplicity-focused design philosophy. Their combat experience provided real-world validation of theoretical concepts that had been debated in engineering circles for years. The aircraft's continued service with Allied nations provided ongoing demonstration of its enduring value. While American forces transitioned to newer platforms, A-4s continued flying combat missions in other conflicts, accumulating additional proof of their effectiveness. Each successful deployment reinforced the lessons learned over Vietnam and expanded the aircraft's legendary reputation. Perhaps most importantly, the A-4's legacy influenced how military planners thought about force structure and operational doctrine. The aircraft had demonstrated that sustained operations by reliable platforms could achieve strategic objectives that single overwhelming strikes sometimes failed to accomplish. This lesson would prove crucial in future conflicts where persistence mattered more than initial shock effect. The training revolution sparked by A-4 combat experience continued long after the war ended. Flight schools worldwide adopted training methods developed by Vietnam veterans, emphasizing practical skills over theoretical knowledge and real-world problem-solving over textbook procedures. The A-4's forgiving characteristics had created a generation of pilots who understood aircraft limitations and how to exploit them tactically. The maintenance philosophy pioneered by A-4 ground crews became standard throughout military aviation. The emphasis on field-repairable systems, modular design, and simplified logistics influenced everything from spare parts inventory to deployment planning. The Skyhawk had proven that keeping aircraft flying was more important than having the most advanced aircraft on paper. Defense contractors found themselves forced to justify complex systems and expensive solutions against the A-4 standard. Procurement officers began asking hard questions about whether proposed capabilities were worth their cost and complexity. The era of unlimited budgets for unlimited complexity was ending, replaced by demands for demonstrated value and proven effectiveness. The A-4's transformation from budget compromise to legendary weapon system had created a new standard for military excellence, one based on results rather than specifications, effectiveness rather than sophistication, and combat performance rather than peacetime promises. The MiG pilots who laughed at the tiny A-4 Skyhawk in 1965 weren't laughing by 1973. They had witnessed the transformation of a modest attack aircraft into one of the most feared weapons in the American arsenal, a machine that delivered more ordnance, flew more missions, and achieved better results than aircraft costing twice as much and weighing twice as much. The ultimate irony was complete. The aircraft dismissed as too simple had proven too effective to ignore, too reliable to replace, and too successful to forget. Subscribe to see how this philosophy influenced the next generation of military aircraft.